hopefully ready to kick off. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Helastel's panel discussion. Just firstly, checking that everybody can hear me. I know there's a few of you sat at the back. Can you hear me well? Good, great. I'm Louise Boulderstone. I'm the project delivery team lead at Helastel. I'm going to be leading the panel discussion today. A bit about today's session. We're going to have the panel discussion. There'll be a portion of time for questions and answers after that. And then if we don't quite get enough time to answer all your questions, there's refreshments shortly after. So please come and talk to us if you want to know anything further. So for those of you who don't know Helastel, we're an award-winning agency. We specialise in IT consultancy, data management, IT infrastructure, and software delivery. So this morning's panel discussion is around the pros and cons of different software methodologies. The most common is usually waterfall and agile. And of course, as the title suggests, the big bugbear that often comes up in software development is Wagile, so the overlap of waterfall and agile processes. So we're going to be talking about those with the panel and understanding a little bit more about the challenges in businesses and their software journeys. So before we kick off, it'd just be really good to know, out of everybody here, who's currently developing software or about to start developing software? Okay, great. And would you say that you're more on the agile methodology side of things? Agile, or is there some waterfall? Yeah? Anybody feel that they're fitting into the Wagile and that's what they're here for and they want to come and discuss it? No? So we have a great panel today. So we're going to uncover some of the challenges, as I said, about what businesses face. So let me introduce you to our Helastel panelists. So we've got James Tipler, who is our Head of Operations. We've got Sukhwinder Talwal, who is Scrum Master and Agile Delivery Manager. We've got Louise, who's our Solutions Architect. And we've got Griffin, who is our Head of Development. So, Sukhi, I'm going to come to you first, because I think it's really good to just outline with some definitions around what's waterfall and what is agile.
Okay. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. Okay. Waterfall is very much about planning up front when doing projects. A lot of time, a lot of effort is done planning in advance before actually starting a project. And so usually waterfall is kind of stuck in budget, time, and scope may vary slightly depending on the time frame. Agile is a slightly different way of working. Agile is about responding to requirements, responding to change, responding to customer needs. If I can kind of, in real simple terms, Agile is really a mindset. People get confused on what Agile actually is. It's actually a mindset. It's a set of values. It's a set of principles. It believes in inspection, adaptation, and transparency. Agile works in iterations, which is basically you deliver a piece of work in a certain amount of time, usually 2 weeks. Then during that 2 weeks period, towards the latter part of the 2 weeks, you plan for the next iteration, etc., depending on the customer's requirements. And to keep it really simple, I'm going to use a simple example. Say, for example, if you buy a house and you want a 3-bedroom house, kitchen, usual stuff, £500,000, there you are. You've told the client you want a house. Now, once the house is complete, you get the keys, there you are. That's waterfall. Now, how Agile, in real simple terms, is they're building the house and the builders call the customer in and say, do you like the paint? And you've got a chance to have a decision on whether you like it or not, or whether you want to change it. Then depending on the colour of the paint may determine the colour of the floorboards. In terms of the kitchen, you thought originally you wanted it in that corner, but you actually want it in that corner. So the customer is actually part of the journey and contributes to the ongoing planning and requirements. The only difference is that when you take that journey, your timeline and the financial input could increase depending upon what the customer's requirements are. Does that kind of explain Agile in simplest terms?
Cool. I think you've got some nods there. Thank you. So you've outlined two very clear different methodologies there. So how is it and why is it that we've got this new term that lots of people are talking about, Wagile, where it seems to overlap between those two methodologies? Why is that happening?
I think what we end up with a situation there, as Suki has kind of described, is you start off with your decision on kind of what methodology you're going to go down, and they are focused down two specific kind of routes there, down either a planning route or a doing route. And I think what happens for a lot of projects is, regardless of which route you go down, there is a certain level of uncertainty in what the actual final product can be and what it will be. And one way or another, I think you end up in a situation where, with all of the best intention in the world, the customer will end up getting a period of cold feet about how the project is going. Certainly with Agile, and I think this is where Wagile really happens, is that you sell them into this idea that they're going to have control and that you're going to spend a certain amount of time, a certain amount of money, and you're going to get them a certain amount of value out of the end of that. And you get a certain way into the process, and they start to think, oh, I don't know, am I really getting what I wanted out of this? I'm really not sure. And through fundamentally not necessarily understanding or trusting the process, they start to go, this is my money and this is my time, and I need to take back control of this. And they start to think in much more waterfall terms again. And that's where Wagile starts to happen, is where the customer is in a position where they feel they need to find out more stuff that they can sign off, and that they can say, I know where we're going with this, so I'm happy, and I'm trusting what is happening. And that's where things start to, I would say, break down, and we find people try to merge what is a development practice of working in Agile sprints, but also trying to placate a customer that they need to bring back that trust.
So how do you think that we can build that trust with customers that we work with when we're in an Agile set of sprints and we're delivering the software in an Agile way? How do we build that trust and take the client on a journey with us? Because there are opportunities within the ceremonies of Agile to consult, to inspect, to adapt. And on paper, it should be the methodology that gives them more flexibility and insight. So how can we build upon that trust to allow them to continue down the right process?
Yeah, so I think one of the things which is kind of key in that sense is that Agile builds on the idea that, especially in software, one of the key metrics is working software. So if you want to build trust with someone that you're doing what you said you would, you should be able to demonstrate to them that very quickly and over increments, you're building new software that's production ready, that is delivering value, that over time you can increment and you can build and iterate and have more functionality available. I think where trust usually breaks down is when they don't feel like the value is being delivered. And typically this is something which I've experienced more in the earlier sprints. When you start software, there's work you have to do up front that you have to do regardless. But in waterfall, that's hidden because they don't see their output until the end when the product is delivered. Whereas in Agile, that's a very visible thing. After 2 weeks, after 4 weeks, even maybe after 6 weeks, they haven't got their MVP yet, they haven't got their product. And that's where, as Louise says, they start maybe getting cold feet because they're still spending the money, but they don't feel like maybe they're where they think they should be. And for less mature organizations, perhaps ones who haven't done a lot of software development, there may be a misconception of how quick software is. Because by the time you're in maybe sprint 10 or 12, you're delivering a lot of value in the same short period of time because of the work that you've done up front. Yeah. So I think being able to show that you can deliver value and, as you say, ultimately, therefore deliver trust that over time you will increment on that product. We just have to get there. It's, I was going to say, not too dissimilar, I imagine, just drawing an analogy to even like a school child. If, in reception, they come home and they've been finger painting, you might think, well, what value is that delivering to them being able to pass their GCSEs? But if you trust the process, over time they'll get there. And I think software delivery is kind of similar.
I've still not nailed the finger painting, but it goes back to the house analogy is a good one, where the initial steps. You need to flatten the ground. You need to put in the foundations to the house in order to build the house, to then be able to pick the colours of the walls and stuff like that. And in the first couple of sprints, that's what you're doing in terms of the project side of it. So it is difficult to show that value in the initial kind of 2 sprints. But like Louise said, it's important that you find a way to do that.
I think everyone can relate to that, can't they? Because if you go back to the house analogy, everyone wants the finished house. They want the nice kitchen that they envisage. They want to know that the paint is what they want and that the flooring is what they want. But when you go and the builders have been there for 6 weeks and all you can see is a couple of block work, you're like, well, what have you been doing? Like, where's all my money gone? Going back to a point you made there, Louise, about maturity. So do you think maturity of, perhaps it's the software delivery partner or the client or both, do you think that's really key in getting it right for Agile?
I think so, because ultimately, if you compare it to other industries, software is a fairly new industry. I mean, realistically, even with the best estimation, it's only been around for maybe 50 years. Whereas you compare that to other industries like house building, which have been around for thousands of years, there wasn't really an option to do it in an agile manner back then. And Agile itself is fairly new, being only 20 years old. So when we talk about maturity, we have to consider what that means in relation to other mature industries. And it is still fairly juvenile. So even a mature software company, if dealing with Agile, can only be 20 years old. And there's only so much experience we can get with that. So I think if you're dealing with a software company, they're probably more likely to have tried Agile before and hopefully succeeded with Agile, which will make them want to try it again. But if they are new to the process, they do require a bit of guiding and hand-holding, because ultimately they won't have experienced it. They won't have that trust yet. And if they're used to, I start on day 1 and by day 100, I have software, they need to be shown why days 10, 20, 30 of each sprint is useful to them, and that ultimately they're getting something faster.
Yeah.
That's where you kind of get some of the elements of waterfall creeping into Agile as well. If the client's immature in terms of Agile, where they've used waterfall before, even if you've been able to sell them into this concept of Agile, they kind of creep back into their kind of creatures of habit of what they know.
Yeah.
So they creep back into some of these elements of waterfall that then they kind of want within this Agile experience, and that's kind of where Agile sort of comes from, essentially.
So when we talk about maturity of clients, what we also mean is it could be a team that you're working with that are really well versed in Agile frameworks and really keen to make it work and to be part of that journey. But they sit within a company that's perhaps not Agile. They've got really defined processes and ways of working that aren't flexible and that don't lend to the Agile process. So is it possible to still be successful in delivering in an Agile way when you are a small Agile team within potentially a waterfall style, more rigid setting as a company?
I think one of the things that we need to take into consideration, and I think you guys have mentioned it, is the maturity of either the software development house or the customer when it comes to Agile. Because people have different interpretations of what Agile is. You know, like I said, Agile is just a mindset and it has principles and values. It's delivered through Scrum, Kanban, Lean, Safe, Crystal, Extreme Programming, whichever one you want to choose. But I think making it clear from the off, the relationship between the customer and the client is critical. The client needs to know what their role in the process is. So if the client wants X, Y, Z delivered, they've got to realize that during that journey while we deliver X, Y, Z, these are your responsibilities. Now, if the client, in collaboration with the software development house, can't agree an MVP, you've got a serious problem on your hands, because if you can't get past that hurdle, it's not going to work. So there's certain things that both the deliverer as well as the customer, in terms of their relationship and their role within Agile, have to understand what that is. And participating in some of the ceremonies, if the customer doesn't, then they're not going to have visibility on how the project is coming along, because one of the key things in Agile is the ceremonies that take place. That's where you get visibility updates on how the software development is progressing. So I think, ironing out people's roles and responsibilities and the relationship at the beginning, otherwise you get this diluted version of what the relationship is critical.
And this is where the trust aspect comes in, and also how Wagile comes about is it's not just about the maturity of the customer ultimately, it is about the maturity of your own business. Because if you are going to take an agile approach, but you're going to basically shut the client out, you're going to say, look, you tell us what it is that you want, and then we will perform these, analysis. We'll say we're going to do a certain amount of work every 2 weeks, and all you end up doing is essentially reporting back to them every 2 weeks. And what you've done for yourself is you've created a set of mini waterfalls for yourself. You've said we're going to deliver a certain amount of work. We're planning what that work is, and the customer is going to expect then that they get that work after 2 weeks, which is just waterfall in lots of different parts, which is where a lot of Wagile definitions will kind of land on, and so including the customer in that process and not making it a thing where I think a lot of companies can get very precious and they can say, we're the experts, and you should say that. If you're a development house, you should feel you're the experts, but you being the expert does not mean you, the customer, are not the expert, because they are in what they know, what they want. They are the expert in their own product, and having it being a tennis match of you tell us some stuff, we will deliver some stuff, and we keep going back and forth like that, is a process that inherently is not going to develop trust, because you're relying on your own ability as a company to hit what you have said you might be able to do. Because in an agile process, you can't claim you definitely can do what you want to do in those 2 weeks, because part of the process is not knowing exactly what all of that development is going to entail.
Can I just add to that point, is that in the basic principles of Scrum, if I can use Scrum because it's the most popular method, is that the client, and I'm going to keep it very simple, the client says, can I have these requirements done within the sprint? And that's their priority, whatever that priority is. The development team actually decide what they're going to do in that sprint, because the development team know what their capacity, what their velocity is. The client can influence as much as they want, but the development team actually decide what they want to do, because they know what they're capable of, and like I said, the velocity. And I think that's a simple principle that people have got to understand, is the client says we'd like this, but the actual development house says this is what we can do, and this is how we're going to do it. The client cannot tell the development team on how to develop software, and that's one of the biggest problems you get when organizations or companies are not very mature.
So we talked about Agile quite a bit here, and not so much about waterfall. So if a client or business is thinking waterfall's not for us, we feel that's a bit too rigid, we don't know absolutely everything up front, we haven't got all the answers to the questions that we know someone's going to want from us in order to get that timeline that we want, the budget that we want to hit. We do want to go down an Agile route. What is problematic about having that overlap of processes? What's wrong with doing it Agile? What issues can that cause?
So I think one thing to consider at this point is there's a notion called the project management golden triangle, and it effectively says that there are three variables in a project. There's the functionality, the time, and price. And typically in a waterfall project, when you go out for tender, for example, you would say, I need this functionality by this point in time, and people would bid and say, and therefore this is how much it's going to cost you. In an agile environment, you would say, I have this much money, and we would say, for example, as the agency, we can deliver you this many sprints of 2 weeks and this many people. And the functionality will be variable based on how much we complete in those sprints. Where things usually start to muddy is if they're buying into the idea of the agile, but they want to start maybe controlling what the functionality is and what the scope becomes. And ultimately, in no situation can you have all three things. One of them has to be variable. And that's usually, I think, where the problem starts to occur, where they'll say, okay, but in the next sprint, we need you to deliver this piece of defined functionality with the existing team.
Oh, well, the waterfall.
It was bound to happen. That was like 20 quid a vodka as well. ultimately with the same team. And the problem with that is you're then trying to combine too many things. So if you're in that situation, back in the room, where you're trying to control everything, ultimately something will go wrong. And that's where things start to creep in. So they say, okay, well, don't worry about doing a retro this week. We don't need to, just show us when it's done. And at the point when they're saying, just show us functionality when it's done, you're in waterfall as Lee got to again. So you have to keep going with the way the process is, and you have to trust the process. And again, it comes back to trust. It comes back to the customer either wanting different forms of involvement than what they had already agreed to, or less involvement than what they had agreed to. And it starts to break down the cadence of how you deliver work. And that ultimately causes you the problem where you go, well, now we're slipping back into waterfall, or even the other way sometimes, a perfectly successful waterfall project slipping slightly into agile in a way that the customer isn't happy with because it changes how they have to behave.
Can I just add to that as well? In technology and software, things change daily. We all know that. And, you know, the customer's requirements, which started off here, a month later could change slightly because of technological advances or whatever. And this is an example I always use. If we're building a website for Asda or working on a website for Asda, and suddenly cryptocurrency, all governments around the world have signed off on it, we agree with it, suddenly Asda is going to have to incorporate cryptocurrency within their system. Now, to do that, you'd have to make it a high priority. So that's an extra requirement added onto the already existing requirement. Does that make sense? So you would prioritize that. So that's where the customer drives what they would like, but obviously the team know what they can deliver. Does that make sense?
So from a project management perspective, obviously that being the area I work in at Helastel, sometimes when you're working with clients, and obviously in a waterfall environment, it's very documentation heavy. There's lots of communication and reporting, and it's very heavy on that. You don't really get that in Agile. Is there a place for better visibility in Agile to help steer away from being sort of the Wagile and going into the waterfall type expectations, or do the ceremonies offer enough visibility in what they show and how they work during the Agile process?
I think it's a good question. I think that my personal kind of view is that where the Agile process can sometimes fall down in terms of the relationship with the customer is that that everything becomes a little bit gospel, in the sense of ceremonies being like the only course. And I think the reality is that the ceremonies are important. They are very vital parts of the Agile process, but they don't supplement what is a separate strand of generally good communication and discussion with the customer on an otherwise ongoing basis. I think problems that always happen, this is not an Agile problem, it's a waterfall problem as well. Problems that always happen with development are because you purely trust the process as if the process is going to deliver a complete understanding between both parties. And if all you do is the elements of the process and you don't supplement that with sessions to discuss, what this work could eventually become, what the opportunities are, because you potentially want your customer to be able to flesh out what has been developed as a current thing can turn into in the future, because they're going to want to know what their opportunities are as well. But if all you do is concentrate on what has happened in the last sprint, and you don't have this other duty of care essentially to your customer of letting them understand what's going on in a wider context of their product, then all they do have to go on is the retros, the demos and stuff like that, which should in themselves be something that build confidence in your product, what you're building. But there is another area of conversation there, which, like I say, it's not an Agile thing or a waterfall thing. That is a customer relationship kind of angle, which I think people sometimes, certainly I think with Agile, they kind of they think maybe we can almost replace part of that by the process doing all the work.
And with the idea of that visibility, that communication, we have to consider that while there are these kind of linear methodologies, waterfall being one of them, there are other linear methodologies. As Suki said, there are other agile methodologies. And in the situation Lee's explaining, something like a V model, for example, where you upfront confirm your requirements for your system, and then you test your requirements for your system and make sure everyone's agreed. And then you confirm your design, and then you test your design. So in that stage, rather than delivering in a straight line, you're delivering something and testing your understanding of that something before you move on to the next one. And that gives a few extra benefits. And it's moving you towards Agile because you're getting that customer communication back and forth. But it's also sticking with the waterfall idea of you do your development and your testing near the end. You do the expensive parts later in the project. The benefit of that, of course, is that you're engaging the customer, and ultimately what you're trying to avoid, the risk that Agile ultimately tries to avoid, is that you get to the end of the project, deliver something, and the customer says, that's not what I wanted. And you've wasted time, you've wasted money, everyone goes away unhappy. So there are ways of migrating people into Agile without jumping straight in and possibly scaring them or having that misunderstanding, even if you want to continue using a waterfall form of methodology.
We're pretty much at time, I think, for this part of the session. I think we're just going to open it up to everybody here. We've got people who are online as well, so I think we'll be looking at potential questions from there. But has anybody in the audience here got any questions that they would like to ask? Don't be shy. Yes.
I was just thinking about that sort of buy-in you get from the customer, especially early on in a project, and how actually showing what work's been, sort of really good work's been done in, say, the first few sprints can actually be quite hard to say, look what we've done, because they'll go, I don't see anything. And I wonder, sort of, I was thinking, as this is, Wagile, if almost there's a place for some sort of waterfall start, almost, to sort of, we use the house analogy to build the foundations and say, look, I'll give you these foundations over 6 weeks. And then we move into a more agile way of working where we start looking at the features. And I argue myself there, I think the only limitation there is potentially if you've got your foundations wrong. But yeah, if that's sort of a way in which you can merge the two, so because I find it hard to fully find a way to get that buy-in sometimes from the customer if you're trying to work in an agile way initially sometimes.
Yeah, so for the purposes of people not in the room, the question was around how you can merge waterfall and agile by using some waterfall up front, perhaps. And to stick with the house analogy, if you were buying or building a house, you would have blueprints. And so you would know, well, you'd have a plot of land to start with, even better. And then you'd have some blueprints for that. So you know roughly what the rooms might look like. As you go, you may choose to change some of the internal walls, for example, or as Suki says, you may redecorate. So you may change some of the bells and whistles. But you do have that upfront waterfall element. It's possible in a software project to kind of do the same, but to maybe flesh out some of the borders of what the software will contain, what some of the high-level features might be. You don't necessarily know how you will deliver them. You may not even know what technology you'll use to deliver them, but you know roughly maybe a few user journeys through the software that you know you'll have to achieve, which will help you then estimate and scope out the project before you start to deliver it. So I think you're right. There is some, not necessarily waterfall, but some actions that happen up front before you jump straight into sprint-based or Kanban-based delivery.
Can I? Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just saying, it's back to Lee's point as well, it's around communication and setting expectations. So don't expect us to be able to deliver something shiny and wow. We are setting those foundations, and this will underpin all the features and the fun stuff that comes in the next 2, 3, 4 sprints. And I think setting that expectation up front can sometimes be really key for them.
Can I just add to that? So I'll just take the question in a second. Is that the basic principles of Scrum Agile is every sprint you deliver something of value. You deliver an increment. Now, something of value is not necessarily functionality or working software. Something of value could be setting up the foundation which leads to these things. So as long as the customer and the development house are very clear on what value means and what value means in each sprint, you know, you can actually overcome that expectation of a customer saying, well, where's the, you know, the dashboard? I don't see the dashboard after the first sprint.
Yeah, in my experience, seems all right. In my experience, actually, taking away, and we've got obviously some development-focused people with it. It's not only just about the development, the UX and the UI in those initial stages can be really key. Particularly the UX, if you can show the user journey of what's going to be happening, what the developer are going to build, some screens, even some sort of splash screens and stuff like that to the user, it kind of, I don't want to say buys you some time, but it kind of does in the background to allow you to do a bit of development work, and then when you merge the two together, it gives you a bit more to show.
So we've got a question that's come from someone watching online. So do you think Agile is overly idealistic in thinking CFOs will commit to projects without a defined budget? And I'm guessing it's a defined scope as well, isn't it? So
I think you should take this one because of our current experience.
Being overly idealistic, so in the context of not having a budget,
of signing off a budget without knowing what they're getting.
Oh yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, I think because that's a huge challenge. You know, obviously, if you're ever going to a customer and you're saying you essentially need to say, you know, here's a bunch of money you have to commit to get something, but also, by the way, we're not going to be able to commit as to exactly what you're going to get. It's a problematic conversation to have. But I think what this comes from is also its roots in waterfall, because what waterfall has taught people in software development for decades and decades is we spend a total chunk of money to get a total amount of product. And where Agile excels at most, in my opinion, is actually in continuous product development. So not where you know where the end product is, but where you know you're continuously improving something. So when you are working in a big company where, you know, if you say, you know, you're working at a media kind of company where you have a technology product, you're going to know that you're going to be developing that product every single year, and you're going to be enhancing it. You're going to be bringing in new features. For them, Agile it makes complete sense, because what you're saying is, on a rolling basis, we're going to keep up to date on what we need to update, and we're going to have a certain budget in the year to spend on doing that. When other companies come in and they say, okay, well, we have a situation here, we want to make a product, and you have to have that wrangling about what the budget is and everything. The problem comes from, they want to be able to define how much money is it going to be to get the finished thing. And as a company, you have to draw that back down and say, no, let's not take it to that extent. Let's not go to the point of how much money is it to complete the thing. Let's talk about how much money can you spend in the next 2 months, 3 months, and what value we think we could probably deliver in that kind of time, in a kind of, in the experience of what we've been able to deliver for other projects, and take it from there. Because I think if you're engaging with a customer on the basis that they have something they want, they don't exactly, you know, they want to get a budget idea, then that is something where you have to say, this is not an Agile project you want from us. This is a waterfall project. You want to know what you're getting. You want to know what you're spending. You have to engage with us, not in an Agile term, because you're going to be unhappy and we're going to be stressed. And so I guess to maybe what the question's point was, yeah, I think there are points where potentially companies go, idealistically, we should do Agile. And that is the way that we have to do it, because Agile is the best. But if you've got a client that is not going to engage with the way that Agile is going to work, then it's not the best. You shouldn't idealistically just pursue that.
Yeah.
We're just going to move on questions.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I think perhaps I've already answered it, about the difference in, my experience, it's been a while working on software projects, but also building websites and that sort of stuff. The difference is that the customer may not have the technical understanding, may not know, so they may be asking for requirements, and the developers understand actually how long it might take, and it's harder than they think. So I guess it comes down to communication. So perhaps there might be unrealistic expectations, or managing the expectations of the client in terms of things actually may take a lot longer than they expect.
Yeah, it definitely is actually, and in one of the experiences we always get with stuff like that is the client then going, just scale up the team, scale it up and hit it,
Yeah.
With the deadlines the same, we want this amount of work to scale it up. Like recruitment is like really easy. So we find that really difficult, and obviously there's ways around that in terms of like using contractors and things like that, but then obviously it eats away at profit margin. So the visibility to the client of what is achievable from the start is for us the key thing. There's no point going in there saying you've got 100 sized dev team to try and win a piece of work, and then actually put 3 on then, and suddenly when they want to scale up to 6, you are unable to do that. So for us, it's trying to be as honest and upfront as we can. But like Lee said, understanding that Agile might not actually be the right methodology for what we're doing if they're expecting the world for a set price by a set time, because you can't just scale up.
It adds risk to them as well, doesn't it? There's always ways to scale up, but it doesn't come at, oh well, we'll just do double the amount of effort in the time, and you're adding risk around the people who are coming onto the project who are potentially unknown to you as a business. You don't know that their skill set is exactly what you need. Their knowledge goes with them.
Yeah. There's ramp up times. Yeah, there's ramp up times for anyone you bring onto the project. You particularly from contractors you've not used before, you don't know their experience, they don't know your processes. It's not as easy as 9 developers can do it in a month type of thing. Not always the situation. So yeah, got to keep all that in mind.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just back to the CFO question. As a former CFO, I can definitely relate to the question that was asked. So, we talk about trust and the communication. Would you suggest bringing in, say, a key stakeholder like the CFO, because their understanding of the project and the budget that they need to allocate and how things are going to work is surely going to be quite important as well? Would you suggest us bringing them into that initial education piece?
So just for people that are online, so that question was just around, is it important to be bringing stakeholders within the wider business into the process to build that trust and have that visibility at a higher level than perhaps the project team that you're working with?
I think the answer probably is unanimously yes. The more people that can be involved, the more stakeholders that can be involved, that you can give them that education piece up front. Without that, I think back to a project actually that I ran many years ago, but it was sort of an 8-month project, and it was run Agile, and then at month 7, the marketing director got involved, and the chaos that the chaos that person caused because it wasn't on brand, it like all this other stuff that should have been done, and we ended up having to do 3 additional sprints, and getting sign off on that was difficult. But had that marketing director been involved from the start, we would have been on course all the time. Yeah, so definitely yes, in my opinion.
Yeah, that is a key point actually, isn't it? If, sometimes you focus on the right people within the software delivery partner, but actually that's equal on the client side, making sure that they are bringing the right people in to have the right viewpoint from that business. So the marketing person thinks different to the CFO, that thinks different to the software developer, that thinks different to the product owner. So you need to bring all of that together, and that's quite a skill, and making sure that the client understands that that is a big and important role on their side of the project is really important.
And the discovery sprint at the start is the place to do that.
Yeah.
And again, that's something that I think that's something that's not waterfall or agile dependent either. That comes back to just good practices with customer communication, because when it does come to agile, obviously, technically speaking, in terms of your project, you definitely want people from both sides involved as much as possible. But in your actual agile process, you don't want that. But it definitely is a too many cooks will spoil the broth situation. So, the company that you're working with and yourselves need to have very good delineated roles and responsibilities.
I think the person, sorry to interrupt, I think the person that's really ultimately responsible for that is the customer's PO, because it's the customer's PO who's responsible for return on value, getting work across the line, priorities, but that happens in discussion with the stakeholders, and the CFO could be a stakeholder, the CEO could be a stakeholder, senior management, the board could be stakeholders, but a mature product owner will couple all that together, bring it onto the table of the project.
I think we're we're getting to the end of the Q&A, so we're going to take one from the online, and then we'll come to you as our last question, because I know that you had your hand up as well. So where there's no fixed endpoint, does that make it harder to identify when projects have issues? That's a good question.
I would say that it depends on the kind of software that you're going to be developing. Again, this comes down to one of those situations where Agile definitely thrives in a situation where you've got software that is more modular, and where you can be in that situation where you can be pretty confident that you're building a unit of software or a group of functionalities. And yes, there may be issues down the line, as there would be with any kind of continuous development of software, but you are trying to basically compartmentalize your different developments. If you've got something that is, and you kind of realize either during development or up front that there is going to be a lot of interdependency between lots of different systems that you see are going to have issues even when you're focusing on components of work, then yes, that is something which I guess arguably you could say that's the sort of thing where you need to highlight this is something that needs more upfront planning and naturally is not going to be as useful for Agile processes.
And actually having an Agile project doesn't mean there's no fixed endpoint. Everything should have a goal. It might not be the ultimate endpoint, but every goal is an interim endpoint. So I think that's important, because it isn't just about, we'll just keep going, and if we don't get it and it doesn't work in this sprint, we'll try again next sprint, and the budget's ongoing, and so's the scope, and so's the time. Because even in big companies, that would wear thin after a while, and it's not sustainable. So I think we just might have to move on to the last point. Sorry, Louise, but there'll be time after for further chats. So to this lady here for the last question.
So something that you raised that I found quite interesting essentially was that, so at the start of a sprint, you get your customer to agree what they, what requirements they have, right? But ultimately your devs have the final say in what gets delivered. So my question, I guess, is around the conflict. So there's a huge amount of trust there. Your devs are going to decide to do the stuff that is technically feasible, but also in the best interest of the customer. To what extent do you mitigate that, or do you not? Because in my experience, devs don't always pick the things that are of both most value and technically feasible. They will go straight to the technically feasible.
So I'm happy to start. I'll talk into the microphone whether it's working or not. You guys can tell me. I think there's two responsibilities there. The responsibility for maybe the technical lead, the product owner, the Scrum Master, is to prioritize the backlog. And the backlog can be almost infinite if necessary. The devs, of course, will then estimate what's in that backlog of how long those items might take. But ultimately, in my opinion at least, the thing that they should be prioritizing is what the product owner, and thereby the customer, has said is at the top of their backlog. It's the highest priority item for them. So it could be that that's a very difficult thing to do. And therefore, in that sprint, that may be the only thing that's done. But it's the thing that was most important to the customer to be done next. I think where the conflict can come, for example, is if there is a perceived choice of what happens, and the devs choose to do the thing that they think is perhaps better, for whatever reason that might be, than what the customer has decided they think is most important. So to me, it's the list, and the devs pick the top thing from the list. And if there needs to be some compromise, because maybe that thing's too big for a single sprint, it needs to be broken down, then they pick the second thing and the third thing, the fourth thing combined, perhaps, so that they're still delivering ultimately the best combined value. But I don't think the responsibility should be on the dev team to say, this is what we're doing next. It's the customer to say, this is what we would like you to do next, and then we work to their agency.
It's often a developer's responsibility to determine how they implement it, not what they implement.
Yeah, I was just going to, sorry, I was just going to kind of, I agree with what Louise has said. It's just that sometimes the customer may want this, but what they don't realise, it's not very clear what you want. So if it's not very clear and the devs don't know how they're going to solutionize it, then it's impossible to take it into the sprint. Secondly, there could be dependencies on what they want. And if those dependencies are not addressed within the sprint or at some point, the work can't. So when I say developers choose, it's not the developers just, yeah, we'll have that, we'll have that, we'll have that. It's prioritized. And if they can deliver the top end prioritized stuff, they will deliver that. But only because the developers are actually developing the work, they understand the technical side and the challenges they may what's the word I'm looking for? Encounter. That's it. Encounter. So at the same time, that's the point when you would take those questions, you would bat it back to the PO. The PO may bat it back to UI, UX, whoever, architects or whatever, and try and get them resolved. So when you actually start the sprint, you've resolved those issues devs have. Because the worst thing you can do is go into a sprint with an ambiguous story that is estimated for 3 days and it takes 10 days and you've got 10 bugs on it.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by developers have the final say, not because they're in charge, but because they're the ones actually doing the work.
Yeah, no, totally agree and totally understand that shortcoming. It's something we've experienced a lot. I just wanted to dig into that a little bit more, if that makes sense.
And I think, another thing which is critical is that 2 points. One is really understanding the work, and 2, breaking it down into small chunks of functionality. Because if you've got a piece of work, and let's just say, I always use this as an example, you have an API and it's got security on it. If you can deliver the API but not the security element, you've delivered value. If you deliver nothing, you deliver nothing. You can take that security element, create a defect, and deliver it in the next sprint. But you've got a choice. Either you deliver nothing because you couldn't deliver the security element, or you deliver some kind of value that the customer goes, yeah, got it, you delivered it. Next sprint, you're going to deliver the security element. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we're out of time on that, but just to wrap it up before everyone's very welcome to join us for tea and coffee. What, as a takeaway from the session, what key piece of advice or takeaway would you say is key in deciding what methodology to choose when you're developing software? Just very briefly.
Or along the line.
Yeah.
We've touched on it quite a lot. For me, it's understanding the maturity of the client and understanding do they know exactly what they want up front and which one of those, which 1 or 2 points of those triangles is it they're looking for. Don't always just assume that Agile is the best methodology to use. There's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall, and in some circumstances, it's definitely the best way to do it. So understand the client's maturity, understand what's driving them to actually deliver the software. Is it a cost? Is it a time? Is it a budget? And understand do they know exactly what they want and how collaborative it needs to be.
For me, it's customer collaboration, and I'm going to break it down further, but not too far. Is the relationship with the customer, having the ultimate understanding of what both of your roles and responsibilities are within the process. So that's very clear, because if the customer or yourself are not at a certain maturity level and you don't understand your own roles and responsibilities within the process, it's never going to work. Oh, sorry.
I think maybe I made a flippant comment earlier about finger painting, and as we've been talking, I was kind of thinking about it. So I think when we're talking about software methods, Agile is scary, and there's no getting around that. For a customer, Agile is scary. But if we stick with that analogy, it's also something we actually deal with in our day-to-day lives. If any of you have children, every morning you send your child off to school, and then they come home and you ask them how their day was, and they show you their homework and what they worked on, and then the next day you send them off to school again. And you do this day in, day out for 16 plus years. Imagine instead if when your child was 4, you sent them off to boarding school and you didn't see them until they turned 18. That's a waterfall project.
What if you did something that they come back with?
Well, exactly. They come back with what you told them when they were 4 they had to be. So Agile is scary, but we actually do it every day and we don't even think about it. And by coming back and getting feedback on what happened, we make decisions about the next day and maybe where we need to take mitigating action and what's good and what's bad. And we use that to drive decision making. So why are we so scared about doing it for a piece of software?
I would say that as a company, if you're trying to work out what methodology you need to go for, the key is if it is a small bit of work, or if you know that the client has a lot of time, as in the deadline isn't a factor so much, then waterfall may be something that could be comfortable. Certainly in the situation where you're talking about very small bits of software or small enhancements to existing software. If you are faced with a situation where there is a particular limited budget and a particular limited time, that's where the benefits of Agile can come in, because they can get more for their money and their time by getting on with the development and getting something done. There are always going to be pros and cons in both of those situations, but broadly speaking, waterfall demands either time or low scope, whereas Agile demands flexibility.
So that's it for today's panel discussion. Thank you to everybody that's been part of it. Thank you for everyone's questions. If you're staying in the engine shed, please join us for tea and coffee, and yeah, we look forward to chatting to you more.